Some of the most common moral objections to our economic system is the focus of our time in this segment. I want to touch on 4 primary moral objections that are raised to our economic system, particularly our more market-oriented economic system. One of the things to watch for in the media, however you get your news, are some of the moral assessments and critiques that are often given of our economic system. Several of these are very common. There's certain times when these critiques are more frequently given, particularly during election cycles. The idea that there would be some sort of moral assessment of the workings of our economic system is actually a very common and long-standing tradition. It's very clear that economics is fundamentally a moral discipline because economics talks about the ways in which we share the burdens and benefits of our common life together in community, which is fundamentally a moral thing. But there are a handful of very common moral criticisms given to our economic system, particularly to our more market-based economic system, that I want to address in this short segment. The first is that our economic system is premised on greed. This is very common from the times in which, back in the 80s, it was called the decade of greed. Some have suggested that Adam Smith, the founder of our market economy, actually said that greed is good. That actually came from the statement of the Wall Street character Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas in the movies. Adam Smith would be turning over in his grave to think that people actually thought he saw that or said that. But the idea goes something like this: that greed is clearly a vice, which is true. In the Scripture, it's considered a vice. And if our economic system is premised on greed, then there must be something morally that's not quite right with that picture. So let me respond to that. Some people have actually responded to say, yes, it is premised on greed, and greed's not a bad thing, and so be it. Our approach is going to be a little bit different to this. I'm going to suggest that the Bible makes a distinction between greed and self-interest, and that our economic system is actually premised on self-interest, not greed. So the difference, I think, is that self-interest is one thing. In fact, the Scripture mandates all of us to pursue our self-interest sufficient to take care of ourselves and our dependents. Greed is where your self-interest is pursued to the neglect or to the abuse or to the harm of someone else or some other community. Now, maybe there are lots of people that are motivated by greed, but we distinguish between that and, I think, legitimate self-interest. Adam Smith was clear that it's not out of benevolence that we get our food from the butcher and the baker, but out of concern for their self-interest. Smith also viewed a number of other virtues as very important for the working of a market system in order to temper a person's pursuit of self-interest. So, one, I think it's not fair to say that greed is what drives our economic system, rather in a vicious cycle. Rather, I would suggest that trust is what drives our economic system in more of a virtuous cycle. And Adam Smith and others of the ideological founders of our market system assumed that the market system would not function without a modicum of virtue among the participants. A second moral objection is based on what we call a zero-sum arrangement of economic life. And this is the idea. The objection is that in our economic system, the rich getting richer is what is causing the poor to become poorer. That there's some sort of cause and effect relationship between the wealth of the rich and the poverty of the poor. That's based on what's known as a zero-sum arrangement in terms of economics, where there's one fixed pot of economic resources, one size for the economic pie, and then if I get a bigger slice, then you get a smaller one. But in terms of economics, that's just simply not true, though it probably is true in some parts of the world and definitely was true in the ancient world when the Bible was written. But today, the size of the economic pie is capable of growing. In fact, every time a profit is made, wealth is created. Wealth is constantly being created as profit is made and economies grow. So the size of the pie is actually capable of getting larger and larger Now, it may be that some people are getting a disproportionate share of that pie. We'll come to that objection in just a moment. But I think the idea that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, that implies cause and effect relationship between those two, is based on a misunderstanding of economics. A third criticism, moral criticism, is that the market system leads to consumerism, materialism, and overconsumption. I'd want to suggest that, like greed, materialism is not fundamentally an economic vice. It's a human vice that we see manifested in any particular economic system. Greed was rampant under socialism, for example. There were just different ways of satisfying someone's greed than in market-based systems. The idea that a market system can lead to materialism, I think, certainly is true. Just because of the wealth of goods and services that are produced and available, that certainly is true. But to say that materialism is only a function of a market system is to make a human vice an economic one. The other thing that I think needs to be taken into account in this is that market systems, with the ability to generate the wealth that they do provide the temptation to greed and overconsumption and materialism. That's true. But they also provide the resources for charity and for caring for the least advantaged among us that are unparalleled in any other type of economic arrangement. It's no accident that the most generous countries in the world are also the ones that are the most market-based in their economic orientation. Moral criticism is that that market economies lead to these invariable increases and huge increases in inequality between the haves and the have-nots. Let me address that, I think, in a minute here. We need to be clear about this, that vast majority of time that civilization has been on the planet, the vast majority of people have been incredibly equal, but they have been equally miserable, wretched, and poor. And the vast majority of wealth held by a very small majority, the 0.0001%. And usually, everywhere market systems have been introduced, inequality has actually risen because middle classes have been created. And there were still people at the very top, but what was created was a class in the middle, so that there were more levels of inequality that were being created. So in most market systems today, it is true that there are classes of people that have been created that were not in existence before. Now, the question about inequality, it seems to me the issue is not that certain people are unequal. The real issue is that those at the bottom don't have enough. That's the issue. So it seems to me that the criticism about inequality is actually shooting at the wrong target. The problem is not that there's inequality. The problem is that there's insufficiency at the bottom of the scale. And I think, to be clear, too, we generally accept all sorts of inequalities that are a result of the natural lottery of things. For example, no matter how hard I train, I will never be an Olympic swimmer like Michael Phelps was, because I simply don't have the genes. I'm not a freak of nature like he is in terms of swimming. No matter how hard I practice, I will never be in the NBA because I just don't have the physical endowment to play professional basketball. Now, we don't seem to get particularly exercised about those inequalities that are the result of uneven natural endowments, though we do take into account some of those things with our progressive tax system, for example. Now, the issue, I think, with inequality is when inequality is the result of injustice, then that's something worth getting exercised about. For example, it's unjust when simply by a child's zip code they are subjected to a substandard education and their head start is significantly farther behind. It's unjust when people of color are victims of a discrimination that holds them back or keeps them from getting jobs, and things like that. So those, when inequality is the result of injustice, that's the stuff to get worked up about. And I think that's what the Scripture actually is also worked up about, as we see from so much of the prophets' teaching on economic injustice.